In part one of Kimberley Adventure, Malcolm Douglas explored the coast by boat, fished the high reefs, journeyed to Secure Bay, tangled with a pack of sharks, ended up stuck at the top of the Roe River, and recorded for the first time on film the rare rough-scaled python. Over the years, Malcolm's been asked more questions about barramundi fishing than anything else. Many of the best barra are found in truly remote rivers, and Malcolm and his mates are heading out of Broome for Wyndham, 1,100 kilometres to launch the boat. Wyndham, at the bottom of Cambridge Gulf, is WA's most northern town. And the Berkeley River, their destination, is far up the coast. After 40 nautical miles, the calm, sheltered waters of Cambridge Gulf give way to the open expanse of the Timor Sea. And it's still another 50 to the Berkeley River. The Berkeley is one of the great rivers of the Kimberley. Far inland, where the salt water meets the fresh, big barramundi swim beneath the rocky banks. Where freshwater streams flow from the escarpment, a barrier of flat rocks makes a good campsite. Here, the best time for barra is early in the morning or late afternoon on a rising tide. Pete hooks the first fish.
We didn't do any landing net, did we? No. It's a hell of a fish. It's a good barra. It's a good barra, and look at that, Pete. Hey, that's a nice barra. Hey? Hey? There's only one thing wrong. You caught it, not me. Hey, that's a good fish, isn't it? Is that good enough for tea? You know. When we get a little fish, we keep it for tea. That's the trouble up here in the Kimberley. You only catch big fish and you've got to let them all go.
Barra this size are splendid eating, but any fish smaller than 55 centimetres must be released. Everyone heading north dreams of landing big barramundi. A superb-looking fish, a tenacious fighter, and good to eat.
Look at that fish.
All barramundi commence life as males, maturing at 3 to 4 years. At 6 years, they undergo a sex change. This is why it's a good idea to release the really big fish.
There you go. Bye, mate.
They're the female breeding stock.
Yeah, he's happy. Good one. Let's go.
These Berkeley River barra are really big. Geez, we lost some gear yesterday, lost quite a few lures, so I'm just working out what we've got left. When I come on a big trip, I bring a whole range of lures, all sorts of brands and all sorts of colours, depending on the conditions, the colour of the water. Two of my favourites are the little rattlers, but I really like this is a pretty smart lure. This is a little killer lure, the little Terminator they call this. He's pretty flash, pink, but probably the best one that's working well in these waters at the moment is the old faithful, the old Nils Master. But whatever you do, bring plenty of lures and plenty of colours.
The Mertens water monitor is common along Kimberley freshwater streams, where they're often mistaken for small crocodiles. This inquisitive reptile scrounges around campsites for fish scraps. At midday, when the fish are off the bite, Malcolm explores the Berkeley River gorges. The Kimberley is renowned for its rugged scenery, and this is truly magnificent. As the shadows lengthen, the men return upstream. And on the rising tide, the barra will take a lure.
Come on, mate. Come on. Come on. Come on. Heavy enough. Oh, geez, heavy enough. You're good fish, isn't he? Yeah.
When you catch barramundi, be very careful of this knife edge secondary gill here. It's got where I'm pointing with the pen knife, it's got a very sharp barb, and this edge along here is like a razor. And people in their excitement will grab the fish, go under there and slice their hand. Be very, very careful of that there. When he's throwing his head too, he's trying to cut the line on it. Very dangerous.
Pete's onto something big.
Oh, look at that. Go on. That lure.
But he's not impressed. It spat the lure.
Oh, he's got him. He's on. He's on. He's on. Put your line in.
On light gear, a big fish takes a long run and cuts the line on the oyster-covered rocks.
Really? Easy, funny thing. Yep. Oh, he's off. Mm-hmm.
So Malcolm tries a different tactic, using the boat to follow the fish.
This fish that Pete caught is just a fraction over 11 kilos, So that makes it about 25 pounds. So there's only 3 of us on the trip, so it's just too big to eat. So Pete's had his fun. He's got a photo. I'm just holding the fish here now while it's getting its strength back, and in a second or two I'll let it go. This is one of the great things about barramundi. They're very tough. Just have one last look at that beautiful fish and we'll let it go. There you go, mate. There you are. He's off. No.
Around the camp at night, huge green frogs emerge from cracks in the rocks. Latoria splendida, the magnificent tree frog. Although classified as a tree frog, the adult is too heavy for light branches and forages instead along the sandstone cliffs. It's the middle of the dry season, the water temperature's dropping, and each day the barramundi are harder to catch.
Oh. Well, it's not exactly a 40-pounder on the old black and gold, but it's our last morning and it's very cold. You know, they've got a jumper on and long pants. You'd be surprised how cold it gets up here in the Kimberleys in the dry season. But I'm actually shivering. But this fish will be our last feed of barra before it's back to Wyndham and back to Broome. Right.
Everything about the Kimberley is big. Even the insects are enormous. The giant mantis is as large as a human hand. If disturbed, it flashes the bright red underside of its wings, signalling danger to predators. It's back to Wyndham for the long haul to Broome. This fishing trip involved 200 nautical miles by boat and 2,000 kilometres by road. In between trips, Malcolm's flat out at his tourist park, showing his crocodiles and alligators to the thousands of visitors that flock to Broome all through the dry season.
4.6, 4.7 metres. There he is. That's your American alligators. They're very... Righto. More likely to pick on the female. That didn't come off. So now we've moved...
Malcolm has spent the last 30 years learning about crocodiles and is always eager to pass on his knowledge during the daily feeding tours. He captures problem crocs throughout the Kimberley and now has some of the biggest animals on display in Australia. The park is home to over 4,000 crocodiles.
Farm just out of town here, about 18 k's. Size of the female, and that's something we're working on at the moment. And if they're only, say, premies, because in the wild you want... Righto, now, I've just got to feed these at night.
bad mood. Come on. Doesn't want to come out any further. Why?
Nearby, a private lake is drained and the barramundi must be rescued. They're rushed around to the crocodile park and released.
Right, Reggie, Don, come on. You want your dinner? Hey, you want your bang? You gotta have smoko, do you? Smoko time.
Smoko, as it's called in the bush, is the morning break. A cup of tea for Malcolm and special formula milk for his female red kangaroo. He looks after orphan kangaroos and wallabies when their mothers are killed on the roads.
You finished? That'll do. That'll do. Come on, I gotta go. You right? Me?
Alright, we'll go. Well, that off.
This little agile wallaby's leg has been in a cast for 2 months. Chased by dogs, she crashed into a fence and broke a leg. Normally a timid animal, it accepts Malcolm's treatment as the plaster's removed. The bones have knitted, and with exercise, the stiffness will wear off. Malcolm's soon on the road again, travelling back to One Arm Point. Strong winds pushing against the tide whip up dangerous seas.
It always happens when you want to go boating. The winds come up. We've driven up from Broome 250 kilometres on that rotten road, put the boat down here on the sand, ready to leave at first light. And of course, during the night, the southeast blew again. They're now gusting at around about 30 knots. I just put my windsock up here. So there's nothing we can do now except put the boat in on the next high tide and go out and shelter behind the lee of the island for a day or two. Just wait there because it's just too dangerous to cross King Sound at the moment. Usually these sou'east blow for about 48 hours and then it just settles down for a couple of days, and that's when we'll be able to head for Talbot Bay.
Over the years, Malcolm's received more letters and phone calls requesting information about the horizontal waterfall in Talbot Bay than any other part of the Kimberley. This trip, he'll show just how difficult it can be travelling to such a remote destination. On the tide change, Malcolm decides to head for the islands of the Buccaneer Archipelago and shelter until the winds drop off. Conditions get worse. The sou'easterlies are up and it'll be days before they ease. The only option is to wait it out. And the men settle the boat down at low tide.
We're still here on Sunday Island, hiding from the wind. We've been here for 4 days now and it's still blowing at 30 knots. You can see behind me the tide rushing out there. That's just tidal surge being pushed along with the wind. Now the wind and the tide are running in the same direction at the moment, but in 2 or 3 hours the tide will turn and it'll be running against the wind, and it'll just be sheer madness to try and head out into the open water. Now by tomorrow the big spring tides will have dropped off, so we can't get to the tidal gorges this week, so we'll have to take the boat back to the mainland this afternoon on the high tide, return to Broome, come back here in about 8 or 9 days' time when the tides are building again and try and head for Talbot Bay, because the object of this exercise, of this trip, is to try and get down to Talbot Bay. But you can see in this country it's not easy.
10 days later, with the winds easing, the men cross King Sound safely and approach the narrow gaps of Talbot Bay.
We've finally made it to Talbot Bay. It's very calm at the moment. We're just on the outside of the first entrance, and as soon as the tide changes we'll go through and we'll have a look at the tidal rush. Now to give you some idea of the rise and fall of tide, it's dead low tide at the moment. You can see this black rock here. Well, if you follow this harpoon up, and I'm going up around about over 11 metres or at least 40 feet, and that's how much rise of tide there's going to be in here in the next few hours. The tide will go right up to the top of the black rock, and 6 hours later it'll be all gone again. This is one of the highest rise and falls of tide you get anywhere in the world. So now we're going to, while it's nice and calm, we're going to take the boat through this entrance, through the second entrance, and just wait for the tide to rise. Get away from these rocks and oysters. There we are.
This is the last entrance through a series of bays. The tide's just beginning to rise and whirlpools are forming. Within an hour, it builds to one of Australia's great natural wonders. Malcolm called this the horizontal waterfall back in 1971 in his film Follow the Sun, and people from all over the world contact him to find out how they can witness this phenomenon. It's possible now to fly over this area in charters from Broome and Derby. While the men wait for the tide to change, lunch is prepared.
Right, around about 5 minutes ago, it was perfectly quiet in here, not a sound. And then the tide changed and now it's starting to build up. It's draining out of this second bay, so now it's time for us to go.
They're heading for the Lassipedes, the main breeding ground in the Kimberley for seabirds and turtles. Turtle tracks from the night's nesting crisscross the dunes. And in the shallows, turtles are mating. A female green turtle always returns to the same stretch of beach to lay her eggs. At night, she crawls into the dunes and spends several hours nesting. She digs herself well down into the sand and uses her rear flippers to carefully shape the egg compartment, where up to 100 eggs are laid. It takes 25 years for a turtle to reach maturity, and then she breeds every 2 to 3 years. Nesting takes hours. Exhausted, she drags herself back to the water. Over 7 weeks later, the hatchlings will emerge to find their way, unaided, to the sea. Back in 1876, the Lassipedes became the only part of Australia ever annexed by a foreign power. An American raised the stars and stripes over these wind-blown hummocks. He was after deposits of bird droppings to sell for fertiliser. A pitched battle was fought on the beach when a crew of Australian seamen repelled the invasion. Formal complaints were made to the United States, and when their president intervened, the American, Roberts, his hopes of a fortune dashed, returned to the United States, a very bitter man. At sundown, the booby gannets returned to feed their chicks. This waterfall is over 1 kilometre long. The tide drops so quickly that for hours water pours from the reef. Few people ever see this spectacle in a particularly hazardous part of the Buccaneer archipelago. The currents, eddies and whirlpools create conditions treacherous for any traveller without good local knowledge. At low tide, it's best to settle the boat down and wait. On exceptionally low tides, strange soft corals are exposed. It's not generally known that the Kimberley coast supports extensive coral reefs. They're visible for short periods only on the low spring tides. The soft, swaying tentacles of the anemone contain a toxin which causes nausea and shock in humans and can be fatal to small fish. An exception is the anemone fish. Immune to the stings, they shelter and breed among the deadly tentacles. Young striped catfish eels, equipped with venomous barbs, can inflict a severe and painful wound. A rare sight, a baler shell lays a mass of sticky eggs. Malcolm knows where a feed of giant oysters can always be found at low tide.
Now that's what I call a good oyster. That's the larger of the two oysters we get up here. We get the small one, which is very common. In certain places you get these huge ones. Look. Have a look at some of these. How's that for an oyster? Look. Look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now that's what I call a feed of oysters. You don't want oysters, do you? These are mine. Now that's an oyster. If you do find these big oysters and they're a little bit strong raw, well, you can just break them off and just give them about 30 seconds in the cold. As soon as they open up, pull them off and you'll find they're a lot sweeter. You ready, eh, Tom? Yeah.
At dead low tide, a reef can be a dangerous place.
On the edge of the reef here is this seaweed, and this is a perfect feed for turtles. There's kilometres of this seagrass, and all along here there are thousands of these old turtles that come up to feed on this. They come to this edge of this reef and they browse here and they die here. Quite often they're too weak and too old to get off the reef as the tide drops and they get trapped. Like this one behind me. Later on in the day, when this reef is completely exposed, this turtle will probably die. So what I might do is just give it a helping hand and move it back into the deep water. Come on, old man. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. You're going to get cooked here. Right, stop, mate. Come on. Oh, wrong way, mate. Wrong way.
A few days later, the men are left high and dry and forced to wait 10 hours for the tide. There's little to do except fire up the primus and boil the billy.
This is way to wild country, the wild northwest of Australia. You're always waiting for the tide to go out, and you're always waiting for the tide to come in before you can move. We were up on this high reef about 30 nautical miles off the mainland of Australia last night doing a crocodile survey. When the tide went out, we just put the boat down on the hard mud. We wait about 12 hours here now because we only have the tide up here for about an hour, and it runs out for 5 hours, and it's got to come in for 6 hours. So right on the top tide, we'll get the water here. And that is really spectacular. It's awesome. The tide runs across these tidal flats so quickly that you have to run to keep up with it. And you don't want to be too far away from the boat because one minute there's dry land, the next minute there's about a metre of water. And there's such a strong current that if you're too far from the boat, well, you can't make it back to the boat and you're in trouble. Just have a cup of tea and just wait for that tide. The tide has just started to move. It's very quiet now, but in about 5 minutes it's going to be tearing and rushing across this flat.
On the beaches around Broome, an average of 50 vehicles a year are trapped by the rushing, rising tide. Nothing can be done until the tide drops. By then, the vehicles have been totally submerged and are a write-off.
This is 5 minutes later, and the tide's really starting to rush, it's really starting to build. Just as I kneel down, you can see this little area here is starting to fill up. I've got to start moving back towards the boat now because the tide is really starting to build. In fact, I'm walking quite quickly and the tide is beating me. So in another couple of minutes I'm going to have to run, otherwise I'll get trapped here. This is when it starts to get a little bit scary. I'm staying here as long as I can to show you what it's all about, but the tide behind me is starting to cut me off, so I want to get out of here quickly. I've got to run around now and get on the boat.
Within minutes, there'll be a metre of water over these sand flats. Malcolm's underway to one of his favourite fishing holes, further along the coast. In part 3 of Kimberley Adventure, Malcolm fishes the high reefs at low tide, has a close encounter with an aggressive crocodile, makes lots of basic lures that work incredibly well.
What I'll try is right. They all look pretty good.
How's that?
Attempts to film a shark feeding frenzy, trolls the racing currents, travels to unusual and spectacular places along the coast. Then journeys far inland to the top of Walcott Inlet.
Dad picked them up by the gills.
Don't miss Kimberley Adventure Part 3 with Malcolm Douglas.